In times of hardship and crisis, history has shown that people tend to come together. Yet over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, societies couldn't have been more divided by politics and ideologies, and us as individuals isolated and rather unhappy. Fear, distrust and hostility have become all the more pronounced over the course of the pandemic, not helped, of course, by the polarization of politics and a sore lack of interaction beyond our limited social circles. As all countries aim to emerge stronger from COVID-19, we ask how people can overcome division and despair, allowing societies to heal from these cracks and move forward. For this, we turn to our very special guest today, who needs no introduction at all. American social psychologist Jonathan Haidt is a professor at New York University's Stern Business School and a household name in Korea and around the world for his best-selling books, The Happiness Hypothesis and The Righteous Mind. Hello, John. It's an incredible honor and so wonderful to have you with us on Arirang.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Soo-young. It's a pleasure to be here.
And we're very honoured and, of course, excited to talk to you at this time, because I think many people around the world are asking why we're all becoming so divided in our communities and wider societies anywhere we are in the world. And you've actually long warned that political polarisation, fueled by our tribal instincts, could spiral into revolution, chaos, a cycle of decline and trust and the decay of a society, all sounding quite familiar. And this seems to have been the underlying phenomenon that really prompted the political and social turmoil that your country, the United States, has experienced, especially over the past year, and led to the storming of the Capitol in January earlier this year. When you wrote The Righteous Mind, did you imagine that one day political polarization would get as bad as it did on January 6th? I mean, how should we really make sense of the events that unfolded and the people who defended and continue to believe Mr. Trump's lies?
Well, I became alarmed at rising political polarization around 2004. And I switched my research over from studying how morality varies across cultures to looking at how it varies between left and right. And by 2008, when I really began writing The Righteous Mind, it was getting so bad that I really got alarmed. Of course, now it is so much worse. It has continued to get so much worse. And the way to understand it, I think, is to look at several interacting causes, several interacting threads that were all pretty advanced by a year ago. And they've all gotten worse with the pandemic and in our country with Trump. So the two main ones that I would call your attention to are rising cross-party hatred, that is left and right hate each other more now than they did, and that allows them to believe anything about the other side. And then the ubiquitous, the spread of social media, so that falsehoods and outrageous lies can spread very quickly sideways between people without going through any sort of editor or anybody with any sort of responsibility. So those two trends have really ramped up the polarization in America and in many other countries.
And social media firms, they were quite rightly blamed for locking the gate after the forces bolted when they decided to delete Mr. Donald Trump's accounts. And well, not only in America, but in most parts of the world, there has been increasing concern and evidence that algorithms designed to keep us scrolling on social media are actually trapping us in very limited patterns, very limited social and political bubbles. And as much as these companies profit from engaging us, do you think they should be held accountable or responsible at all for enabling polarization?
I do think that they should be held responsible. I think that we're seeing a rise of conspiracy theories and extremism in many, many countries simultaneously, and that strongly suggests that social media is to blame or is a major part of the cause. In the United States, we can't really hold them responsible for polarization. We can't regulate them so that they make better citizens. We can regulate them more for falsehood and things that promote violence. So I know that the major networks, at least Facebook and Twitter, are working on that. They're trying to tweak algorithms and see what would work. But then there are so many other platforms, as we're all learning, Parler and Gab, that are not going to take responsibility. So It is a big problem in many countries. The internet is global. Conspiracy theories and populist movements are some of them are becoming global. And we are going to have to adapt as we have to every new technology in the past. This one is just coming on much faster than any technology has ever hit us.
And while trying to look on the brighter side here, while we saw radical groups mobilizing on online communities, not just in the US, but around the world, we also saw quite a unique phenomenon last year where fans of South Korean boy band BTS, they actually mobilized to support protests in Hong Kong. They raised $1 million for the Black Lives Matter movement, and they also took the initiative of drowning out racist comments on social media. What kind of values do you think really united these young people from very different parts of the world and compel them to take political action? And does this at the same time indicate that present-day politics is so divisive and uninspiring that the younger generation need to look at pop stars, South Korean pop stars, for moral guidance, particularly in this time of crisis?
It is fascinating that we're seeing some global things happening for the first time ever, such as the South Korean bans affecting American politics and having an impact. Right now in the United States, everyone seems to be talking about GameStop, this silly stock issue where networked traders were able to cause a bubble that hurt some professional stock traders. So when you take the whole planet and you connect them in the space of just a decade, all kinds of weird things are happening. And I think what we're seeing with young people, or Gen Z, you would call it, people born after about 1995 or 96, they grew up with social media. Their ethics generally, young people are generally more on the left, more on the progressive side. Gen Z is very focused on racism and sexism. And so this is probably happening in many countries. So they're not going to just take any cause. It's going to be mostly progressive political stances, pro-environment or concerned about global warming. So I think it could be a good sign. It could be used for good purposes. But in general, when you unleash large groups, sometimes called mobs, often very bad things happen. So we'll have to keep our eye on this.
And well, we're actually seeing the rise of what many are calling the woke culture or the cancel culture, where the standard really is not to have any standards on anything, but to tolerate everyone and remove anything that might possibly cause offense, from political statements to the comparatively trivial. We witnessed the statues of historical figures being defaced, for instance, toddlers being forced to explore their gender identities, body positive activists criticizing public health authorities, and even news that the next James Bond film is going to be led by a woman of color. Any difference of opinion is being slammed as prejudice and intolerance. Do you think this is healthy?
No, I am a big fan of liberal democracy and the liberal tradition. I think human nature is very tribal. We very easily come into groups that act in very religious ways and burn people at the stake. And I see Western history as a long journey away from that, the development of liberal institutions, democracy, free markets, individual rights. Of course, those have spread very quickly in Asia since the Second World War. So I see that as the long progress of the liberal tradition. Liberal meaning believing in liberty, individual rights, institutions, not the rule of a strong man. And we made a lot of progress after the Second World War all over the world. But in the last 10 years, we're seeing a retreat from liberalism, I think. We're seeing very illiberal movements on the right, and that was very clear in Washington, D.C. A few weeks ago. We're seeing right-wing populism, which is very often racist and very much about building walls. But we're also seeing a kind of a left-wing radicalism, which you were describing, which we call woke, as though they are awakened. And in areas of life that are homogeneous on the left, so at universities, in journalism, in movies and TV, in the arts, in areas where everybody's on the left, you get this weird new dynamic from social media where people have to show that they are more devoted to the sacred causes fighting racism, sexism, global warming, whatever the cause is, they have to show that they're even more, more to the left or more strong on that issue. And you get this competition, and anybody says, "Wait a second, this is more complicated." Well, others can earn points by accusing you of something. And so, yes, we get this woke culture, which could not have arisen without social media.
Well, the longer we remain in lockdown or in quarantine from the coronavirus pandemic, the more isolated we are expected to become, and our social lives, they're expected to become even more digitalized. What significant changes do you expect to see in people's social psychology resulting from all of this, particularly among the younger generation, who are already being blamed for being narcissistic and very divided as we are?
Mm-hmm. So at least in the United States, I don't think that Gen Z, I don't think that the young people are thought of as narcissistic. They're thought of as fragile, weak, easily harmed. And it's not their fault. In America and in Canada and the UK, other countries, we raised them that way. We raised them to believe that that if they go outside without an adult, they'll be kidnapped or something terrible like that. So Gen Z was already more fragile and much more depressed. Their rates of depression and anxiety have been skyrocketing since about 2012. And that's especially true of the girls, much more so than boys, because girls are on social media much more than boys. So that was all happening before the pandemic. Okay, what effect will the pandemic have? Well, already in the US, we see that older people, the elderly, who are most at risk of dying, are the least afraid of it. But young people who have almost no risk of dying are the most afraid of it. I think what we are already also seeing is that human beings need touch. We need to hug. We need direct personal relationships face to face. And we've been getting less of that because of social media even before the pandemic. And of course, now with the pandemic, many people, most of their social contact is through a screen. And so I think you can think of it as though they're eating artificial food. When I was a kid, there was a product called instant breakfast. You just put water in it and had chocolate powder and vitamins, and you could drink that for breakfast. But of course, if that's all you eat, you are going to be malnourished. And in the same way, if all of your social interactions are through a screen and you never really are with people and laughing and touching, I suspect that they will be socially malnourished. And we might see permanent elevations in the degree to which younger people are anxious and depressed. There's a kind of a sensitive period. Your teen years are a sensitive period in which things about your sociality and your politics that are present then will stay with you for life to some extent.
Well, it looks like there's a strong need for inspiration for leadership. How has the strengths or weakness of moral leadership amid the COVID-19 outbreak affected societies differently in their response to the pandemic?
Yes, that's been really a shame. The best way to bring people together and give leaders an opportunity to lead is a foreign attack. When a country is attacked from outside, that really brings people together. And if they're fortunate, they'll have a leader emerge who can lead them well. A pandemic, historically, diseases don't bring people together. A pandemic makes people afraid of each other. So historically, pandemics have led to distrust, fragmentation, very, very bad social effects. If you look at it that way, then you can see that actually the report card for humanity is kind of mixed. In America, our leader gets an F. He, not just didn't only deny science and say you don't need to wear a mask, but he was right away nationalistic. He took the pandemic as an excuse to do America first. All he cared about was, well, he said all he cared about was America, but as we now know, all he cared about was himself. All he cared about was what the news meant for him personally. So we had the worst possible leadership in the United States. And of course, we're in a position to provide leadership or example because of our size and our military power and our organizational power. And we utterly failed to do that. Now, of course, the scientific community was different. The scientific community worked beautifully together across borders. That was great to see. And many citizens groups or people on YouTube or elsewhere. I mean, this was a shared adversity experience for the whole globe for the first time in human history. But our governments many of them did quite poorly. Obviously, your country, or Korea, certainly did extremely well in organizing a response that beat down the pandemic. So I think Korea and Taiwan, Japan emerged from Singapore. They emerged from this really looking quite capable and quite respected.
Well, in any country, though, I think all societies have been experiencing a certain sense of division, as you have in the United States. And you've emphasized how there's a moral balance of yin and yang when it comes to overcoming social division. What kind of moral leadership do you hope to see for societies to really and truly heal and emerge as stronger democracies from this pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so democracies are always subject to demagoguery. Democracy means rule of the people. And Plato and Aristotle saw that when you have a democracy, you often get a demagogue who speaks to the people's passions and makes them angry, and then you get very bad policy, and then you get dictatorship. So democracy is always difficult, especially when the extremes get louder and louder or stronger and stronger. Happened with social media. So I think what we need is leadership that not just speaks well and speaks to the broad society, not to one extreme, but we also need leadership that will take a fresh look at how democracy is faring in the 21st century, and that will lead to reforms. For example, in the United States, we need reforms of how we run elections, because our elections, especially the primary election where each party picks its candidate, those elections generally pick extremists, and that gives us a more polarized and dysfunctional government. So things are changing very quickly because of technology and especially social media. And a good leader is someone who understands that and can compensate for the polarizing effects.
I'm really trying to bring people together, even in their differences. And well, at a time when everything seems to be beyond our control and a return to normalcy still seems well out of reach, what do you think are some steps we can take to find happiness from between, as you said, in the happiness hypothesis?
Yeah, so in my first book, The Happiness Hypothesis, I considered various hypotheses about happiness, that it comes from getting what you want, no, that it comes from within, well, that's better. But ultimately, the best way to understand human happiness is that it comes from between. That is, it comes from getting the right relationships between yourself and others, yourself and your work, and yourself and something larger than yourself. Humans evolved to connect. We evolved in very intense groups that circled around sacred objects and shared religion. And so in the modern world, we often find ourselves disconnected. So I think during pandemic, for example, if people focus on their relationships to others and spending time with others, even if you meet outside and go for a walk, or use technology but face to face, not typing words as much. So yourself and others, yourself and your work. If you can't do productive or paid work, at least building skills, feeling that you're making progress. We get more happiness from the path than we do from reaching the destination. And yourself and something larger than yourself. Many people are finding communities to get involved in, causes to work for. I suppose being a fan of a Korean boy band and then taking on social purposes beyond the music, that could well give young people a sense of connection. It could be very good for their health.
Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure, Soo Young.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.